Shalom and welcome to Jerusalem Studio. Iran has invested a lot of efforts over several decades now in advancing its nuclear project, giving it the option of trying to race towards nuclear weapons if it so chooses, which Western intelligence says it has not yet done. But if that is the case, then another way of putting it is that Iran is a mere policy decision away from shedding its civilian use custom in favor of admitting the true nature of its nuclear enterprise. Iran could opt for remaining in its current position of a de facto threshold nuclear weapon state, or make a run for a fait accompli, forcing Israel and the United States to rise to the challenge and make good on their threats to do everything in their power to disrupt and destroy it. How close are we to this very moment, and what are the implications of such a move? With us to analyze it are, all the way from the United States, Professor Russell Berman, who formerly served as a senior advisor at the State Department's Foreign Planning Staff, and currently is the director of the Middle East Project at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. It's good to see you, Russell.
Good to see you, Jonathan.
It's always a pleasure indeed. Also joining us from the Big Apple, namely New York City, is Dr. Olli Heinonen, formerly served as the International Atomic Energy Agency Deputy Director General, and currently a Distinguished Fellow at the Stimson Center at Washington, D.C. It's good to see you, Olli.
Thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure indeed. And with me here in the studio, our TV7 editor-at-large, Mr. Amir Oren. Amir, set a stage for us.
Well, let's leave Israel aside for a moment, because Israel is involved in its several fronts: the war in Gaza, Lebanon, Judea and Samaria. And if one were to listen to Prime Minister Netanyahu earlier this week, one would have gotten the idea that a certain strip of land called the Philadelphia Corridor, bordering Gaza with Egypt, is Israel's main security concern, rather than the Iran nuclear enterprise. But reverting to the general picture, from the circular which Director General Grossi sent only earlier this week, one can sense an air of desperation, perhaps frustration, perhaps even impotence, because Iran is still doing whatever it wants. Of course, Grossi says that this started after former President Trump decided to break away from the JCPOA back in 2018. But nevertheless, the situation right now is that Iran is not cooperating with the IAEA. It has forbidden several inspectors from working because of their nationalities. And it is even trying to interfere with the work of the nuclear agency on another matter altogether, the additional protocol, which has to do with the entire NPT regime. So it is up to the Iranian authorities under the Supreme Leader Khamenei to decide what is in their best interests, and it is and behooves the West, United States, Israel, to be prepared for the worst.
With regard to the Philadelphia Corridor, it is a pressing matter at hand. Of course, it's not on the same scope of contending with Iran's nuclear program, which Defense Minister Yoav Gallant urged while chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the United States, C.Q. Brown, visited Israel. He urged the American top officer to prepare, together with the IDF, for various contingencies that may come in handy the moment Iran makes such a decision of breakout. And on another point, just for the matter, even though the Trump administration did pull out of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which it did, unfortunately, without a snapback of the sanctions prior to its decision to move ahead with doing so, which rendered its request to snap back sanctions against Iran mute within the UN Security Council. Nonetheless, it was only after the Biden administration assumed office that Iran started to enrich beyond the 3.25%, which was rendered as the low point or the high point of what it may enrich within UN Security Council Resolution 2231. But I'd like to turn to Dr. Heinonen and ask you specifically about the current state of play when we look at the documents circulating amongst the Board of Governors with the reports referring to this document, of course, raising the alarm over the disparity, as Mr. Oren correctly mentioned, in the attitude which the Director General Rafael Mariano Grossi projects. Are we to take out of this that the agency regards Tehran's maneuvers as inevitable when we're talking about nuclear weapon capabilities?
Certainly, thank you. Certainly the capabilities are there. If we go back to the history to 1990s and early 2000s when Iran started this more cohesive Ahmad plan to develop 4 or 5 nuclear devices and to be even ready to test one. This was then halted in 2003. We have seen that from the documentation what it was. So they probably have a very good know-how how to make a simple tactical nuclear weapon with these material stocks which they have today by enriching them slightly more. And this is how they put the pressure to the international community. This is the way they handle the IAEA. They scare some of the member states that if Iran is pushed too hard, it may decide to go and actually build the nuclear device. But I would not render myself to this kind of threat. There are still a couple of steps which Iran has to do if it wants to proceed. First is it needs to end this to 90%. It's hard to believe that they go straight to a nuclear weapon, but they will use this as a bargaining chip. At the same time, I see that the new foreign minister understands that JCPOA as it was will not work in reality. But at the same time, they are only after one thing. Maintain the nuclear enrichment capability, the weapons capability, reduce the stocks, reduce the scope of the enrichment program in return of the relief of sanctions. And this is the crux of the matter. How does the international community deal with this deal? It needs to be negotiated so that Iran doesn't have any more of those bullets which it is now using to blackmail the international community. New thinking is required, not rush to an agreement, I think, not rush also to photo opportunities. The IAEA has concluded last year in March this agreement with Iran, how to solve the remaining safeguards issues. There's been no progress at all. So another trip, another concession, another photo opportunity will not change anything. Now it's for the IAEA Board of Governors to act, and also those UN Security Council members which can actually institute the snapback action if they so decide. The ball is now in their corner, how they are going to negotiate the new agreement.
Thank you, Dr. Heinonen. Professor Berman, when we're talking about the time in which we're living right now, new thinking is required. When will this new thinking immense once a new administration takes hold of the White House? And would that not be rendered as too late when we're talking about the process in which Tehran is currently engaged in a race towards nuclear weapon proliferation?
Jonathan, thank you for having me and thanks for the question. I'm not sure that new thinking really is on the horizon. It's needed to be sure, as Ulias pointed out. But what might happen between now and November is what he fears, and that is a photo op. The Biden administration might try for something in order to promote foreign policy credentials against the backdrop of the Afghanistan debacle. Um, a handshake with Iran might bolster the Democratic chances in the election campaign. That's not good, but it is not impossible. Um, After the election, or once a new administration is in place, let's say in January, forgetting about the interregnum between November and January, um, the Harris administration, I believe, is not committed to new thinking. It's committed to continuing the policies of the Biden administration. There may be some nuances. There may be some harsher rhetoric toward Israel, but I don't see any evidence of stronger or of an alternative Iran policy. With President Trump, one imagines that he will revert to the policy of his administration, that is maximum pressure. And this would be consistent with the analysis that many, not all, share, that Iran is the root of the problems in the Middle East, and that only by pressuring Iran, much more significantly than is currently the case under the Biden administration, will there be changes in the nuclear file or in the various conflicts in the region, in particular in Israel.
Well, the National Security Advisor, Vice President Harris, is pretty much within the same scope as Professor Berman mentioned, but it seems like Vice President Harris during the DNC had some very strong words about the Islamic Republic and pretty much legitimizing Israel to confront the Iranians. Is this just mere rhetoric for the elections, or is this something that may surprise all of us?
Well, ironically, President Trump had some kind words for the Iranians. He said that he was tough, but also that he was willing to try and get a deal with them, not necessarily.
He never hid that.
No. He said that he was willing to embrace them, not necessarily a nuclear deal. He had some contradictory signals. Now, what will a President Harris do in any domain, of course, is premature to say. But if you look at the Iranians, what they really want is regime protection. And this has to do both with the immunity that they want from an attack on them, from regime change from outside, and they want a better economy in order to placate the domestic audience that they have. Both of these can converge for another agreement. Now, the first agreement was supposed to expire, the sunset clauses, in 2030. We are already close to that timeline. So maybe a new agreement, if it can ever be achieved, will be in the mid-2030s. One would have to weigh the pros and cons of whatever draft will be presented. But as for the photo op remark that we heard, maybe we will see it during the General Assembly meeting, as usual, in September in New York. Would that be beneficial for candidate Harris? Not at all. Who is going to vote for Harris among the independents or the undecideds just because she would be seen shaking the hands of the new Iranian president?
Well, time will tell, of course, what may evolve there. But I'd like to ask Dr. Heinonen, when we're talking about Iran's nuclear aspirations and activities, what is the timeline, considering the various factors that we do know about? Of course, there are a lot of gaps which remain unknown to the international community. I hope that the intelligence communities are more within the scope of knowledge. And if it were to seek a certain breakout, would it truly guarantee Tehran's capacity to deter other countries with a mere tactical nuclear weapon?
Well, this is a good question. And, first of all, I would look little back to the history how India and Pakistanis developed their own nuclear deterrence. And I think it was Mr. Kakodkar, who is the former head of the Indian Atomic Energy Commission, said that good deterrence, first deterrence, is a half a dozen tactical weapons, nothing more. That's all what we need to deter Pakistan. So if we take that line and then we look on those numbers which are now on the table, 160 kilograms, 60% enriched uranium, you can turn it to 90% enriched uranium with, let's say, with the 4 IR2 cascades in 1 month time. Then you will have high enriched uranium, but not only high enriched uranium, but you can also machine them to weapon components using that system which Dr. Khan kindly shared with Iran. So in 1 month's time, they can produce, with that information which is available there, enough uranium metal components for 4 nuclear devices, not very sophisticated devices. That is an important number. Because if they have done like the US did during the Manhattan Project, nuclear weapon, every other component was ready. Only thing which was missing from the Hiroshima bomb was the last drop of uranium. As soon as they got it, device was put together, shipped overseas, and dropped to Hiroshima a little bit more than 1 month later. So this sets us a certain timeline, which is not very, very flourishing. The other one is then this 20% enriched uranium. Oh, it takes a little bit harder. It's a bit harder to enrich, but in half a year time, 200 days around, you can have enough nuclear material for 6 simple nuclear devices. That's quite an accomplishment. So in theory, if you just look at half a year time window and not all the material which they have, they can have 4 to 6 nuclear weapons. Would that be enough? Well, certainly not to attack mainland US, not perhaps even to wipe away Israel, even they talk about it, but it will be a tremendous threat to the countries in the region, and this will give them the leverage which I think they want if they plan to proceed that way. But I would be cautious. They don't need yet to build the weapon. Just to go to 90% will certainly get the attention of the people without manufacturing actually the weapon.
And as Mr. Oren mentioned, of course, if the goal of Breakout is regime protection, this is not the way to do it. Nonetheless, Professor Bourbon, within the scope that remains until a new administration takes office, can we expect U.S. resolve to remain by its commitment that it will not allow Iran to gain nuclear weapon capabilities, let alone field a nuclear weapon?
Frankly, I'm not sure. If the issue is, will the United States act if Iran gets to 90%? I'm not convinced the Biden administration would take steps. It's been very reluctant to take steps so far, particularly with regard to sanction enforcement. But with regard to the conversation we had about the statements by the two candidates, candidate Trump, candidate Harris, at this point, I would regard any of those statements primarily as relevant to their electoral strategies. Former President Trump wants to profile himself as oriented toward diplomacy rather than toward war. That's consistent with his self-understanding as the peace president. Vice President Harris wants to move toward the center because people are afraid that she will be caving into the progressive wing of the party. So her tough statements are electoral, just as his conciliatory statements are electoral.
Indeed. Well, Mr. Owen, of course, we do not have very much time left, but nonetheless, let's bring Israel into the picture. Defense Minister Yoav Gallant did mention the necessity, as I mentioned earlier, with General C.Q. Brown of the United States to prepare contingencies for such a scenario. We don't know what was ultimately said behind closed doors. Nonetheless, Israel does have more tools at its disposal now that the war has gone through for 11 months to potentially take out some of Iran's nuclear capacity. And that, of course, the question of whether or not it's permanent or not, nothing is permanent in life, and therefore it can rule out this statement altogether, or this consideration altogether. But there are other methods in which Iran can be leveraged into avoiding breakout.
Well, there are three components here: intelligence, then an operational response, and the political decision-making process. The first key is, of course, intelligence. The new director of military intelligence, Major General Shlomi Binder, was known during the time he prepared himself to move from the operations division of the General Staff to this position, which in Israel is the most important part in the intelligence community, rather than the civilian agencies. He was most concerned with the notion of surprises. How can he rest assured? What should he do in order to avoid surprise? Now, in the political context, we are talking about an October surprise. And if the Iranians want one candidate to win in the United States over the other, perhaps they will do something in October. In order, from their point of view, they're also hacking the various campaigns and all of that. Now, an operational response, Israel has been preparing. Whether the government right now can rely on a national consensus, will the people believe the government if all of a sudden it says that it is undertaking an operation against Iran? It will need the intelligence professionals to vouch for it, that it is not just a politically motivated operation. Right now, there is such a gap between the professionals and the politicians that one can hardly see it. But in a national emergency, they will probably join hands.
Of course, I am highly doubtful that anyone would launch a full-fledged attack against Iran, knowing what it entails, without understanding the pure necessity of such an operation. And whether we like it or not, the military is subject to the rule of law, and therefore are subject to the defense minister, who is subject to the prime minister, and go on and so forth. But none of this would happen without the green light of the United States, and political will, of course, at such a crucial time is a matter that we all should consider. In 1.5 minutes each, if I may, what should we expect in the near future, and what should we be concerned of, in particular within the context of nuclear proliferation vis-a-vis Iran, considering that it is causing somewhat of a balance, shaking the balance of the NPT with its latest activities? Dr. Heinonen, we'll start with you.
Thank you. I think it's important not to rush to a quick deal at this point of time, but try to have a longer-term thinking how to deal with this nuclear issue with Iran in the region, to make sure that the other countries don't start to follow the example of Iran. And this will have also impact on North Korea. We have to remember that we live now in a very, very different world, multipolar world, axis of resistance, so the war in Ukraine. So there are many, many parameters which have an impact on this, on top of all the other events which take place, like the US election. So I think that we live a time of uncertainty, and important is to prevail calm.
Professor Berman?
I think it's right to pursue this matter not only in beyond the Iran file, but to look at the international context. The lesson that we have reluctantly taught the world, really since Libya and certainly since Ukraine, is that regimes should be reluctant to give up their threshold nuclear power in order to preserve their stability. Ukraine sent its Soviet era nuclear arms back to Russia, and ... Russia invades Ukraine. Iran is going to be very concerned about maintaining regime stability, but we should look that issue straight in the eyes. Maintaining regime stability, giving guarantees to regime stability means giving guarantees to a pretty terrible dictatorship. I'm not arguing for aggressive regime change, but the West faces not only a security but a moral dilemma facing Iran.
Absolutely, Mr. Owen.
Well, there is this perennial tug of war between the immediate and the crucial. And Israel should arrange for itself some respite to recover, recuperate, and look again at the most important issues of the day, including, and perhaps top of the list, the Iranian nuclear project.
Absolutely. Well, this is all the time that we have for today. I'd like to thank Dr. Olli Heinonen, Professor Russell Berman, and Mr. Emil Oren. I'd like to thank all of you at home as well. Until our next edition from here in Jerusalem. Shalom.
Shalom, I'm Danny Ayalon, former Israeli ambassador to the United States, former deputy foreign minister and member of Knesset. Today, I'm very privileged to be hosting TV7's Middle East Review and also being a panelist of the various shows of TV7, which I find the most enlightening, most educating if you really want to understand the world, the global scene as well as the regional scene of the Middle East. It is worthwhile to watch TV7.
For more of TV7's productions and editorials, we invite you to visit our website at tv7israelnews.com.